Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Delbert Rohach and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by my friend.
I'm Giselle Donnelly. I'm also at AEI.
Our friend Julia Joja will be joining us later during the show as she is very much out of character, running behind the schedule a little bit. We have the great privilege of welcoming Mantas Adominas, the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Lithuania, to the podcast. On the podcast, we talk about the many challenges to European peace and security that have erupted along the line, running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and about why those matter to the United States. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider reviewing and rating the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you. Vice Minister, we have to start on the topic of the day, obviously, which is the upcoming Vilnius summit. So I'm recording this podcast from Bratislava, where I listened to the speech by the French President Emmanuel Macron yesterday, in which he said that he was in favor of giving Ukraine clear and tangible security guarantees going forward. He mentioned a path towards NATO membership. At the same time, he made the caveat that he didn't think that there was a consensus within the alliance in favor of a clear path towards NATO membership for Ukraine. Lithuania obviously is not only hosting the summit, but has also been at the forefront of efforts to make the case for Ukraine's future NATO membership and for sort of solidifying this sort of consensus within the alliance. So what are your expectations for the summit? What would you consider a success coming out of the Vilnius summit?
Thank you very much, Dalibor, and it's good to be on your podcast. And it's a very pertinent question. It was not just Globsec. Today, I'm following Oslo Ministerial, which is unfolding as we speak. In fact, I think that there is a sort of change of perspectives and there is a change of expectations. And in that context, for us, the success of the summit is in three principal dimensions. And one of them is Ukraine's NATO prospects. Secondly, it's defense of the eastern flank. And third is defense spending. Obviously, the accession of Sweden to NATO during the Vilnius summit would be absolutely sort of wonderful. But these three dimensions is what for us defines a successful summit. And to go to the first one, and probably the most controversial, is Ukraine's prospects. Well, obviously, we realize that membership is not going to be offered, and that even the timing may be sort of difficult. But we need a clear perspective and then a step forward from Bucharest language. We need to give a very clear perspective. We have to give algorithm, having fulfilled which Ukraine would become a member of NATO. This goes beyond security guarantees, because security guarantees are very important, but basically security guarantees mean only one thing. It's the perpetuation of the existing level of support, military, economic, political, to Ukraine's efforts to defend itself against Russia's aggression. Security guarantees do not mean anything in the shape of Article 5. It does not mean actual sort of involvement of the alliance, and it shouldn't. But we have to be very clear what they contain. They contain simply extension into the future and long-term commitment to help Ukraine militarily, politically, economically. We need to go beyond that. We need to give a very clear political perspective and a sign of progress. And this is a very important message, both to Ukrainians who are doing their utmost to defend us, the Eastern NATO countries, from potential Russian aggression, to defend NATO and NATO security, insofar as while Russia is involved in that war, it cannot attack in other directions. But also, this would be a very important message to send to Russia, because if there is no political progress on Ukraine's NATO membership, that sends a signal to Russia that actually their war is succeeding. They are managing to stop Ukraine's integration in NATO. And that would only encourage their further sort of aggressiveness. In fact, the other, vice versa, if we send a very clear message, that would be de-escalation, not escalation. When Russia encounters very clear boundaries, it tends to step down.
I wonder if we could talk about the second item on your list of measures of success. It's something that we've talked about a lot on the program, but at least in the American conversation, doesn't get quite the attention probably that it does in Lithuania or Eastern Europe. And there are certainly questions to be asked or to be addressed on the part of the alliance as a whole as to what we imagine future security arrangements across Eastern Europe, across NATO's Eastern Front, to be like. I'd be really interested in your views of what the post-victory. Let's hope for the best. A post-Ukraine NATO posture or NATO arrangement looks like. Again, particularly with the concentration on containing and deterring Russian aggression.
Thank you very much. That's an extremely important question. But before we go to post-Ukraine security architecture in Europe, we have to think about security architecture during Ukraine. And we've been over a year into this war, and while there's been some deployment of materiel and troops in Poland, the landscape across the eastern flank is very uneven. It can go from countries like Bulgaria, which it doesn't border on Ukraine, but it's on Black Sea, so Russian Navy is just off their sort of coast. Then Romania, then the Baltic countries, and there I must say that a year and a couple of months into the war. The security posture hasn't changed since the time before the 24th of February 2022. So and then given, for example, the Baltic countries that they only linked to the rest of NATO through not fully 100-kilometer Suwalki Gap. It's between the heavily militarized Kaliningrad and Belarus, which is increasingly incorporated into the Russian sort of military structures. It was from Belarus that the attack on Kiev was launched in February and March last year. And recently the agreement was signed between Belarus and Russia to deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus under Russian command. So, the Baltic countries have not received any bolstering of NATO presence. They still rely on this old concept, which I think became obsolete with this war of kind of tripwire defense, token presence of NATO troops and the concept of recovery of territory if it's taken by Russia. But, after Bucha, Borodanka, all this massacres of civilian populations, it's not a viable concept anymore. So we have to move to deterrence by denial, and actually to have a NATO forces in place which are capable of fighting back, actually, and not allowing the famous inches of NATO territory to be captured by Russians. So this is something that we very much sort of argue for, that it becomes a part of the summit language, part of the summit documents, and that there is a real commitment to deploy actual troops, not just the kind of notional brigades which sit somewhere in the home countries and kind of are meant to be deployed if trouble arises. When trouble arises, it might be too late, especially given the fact that Kaliningrad boasts sort of a very significant anti-access area denial sort of capability. So this might become difficult, and so that's the second dimension. What to do now.
And may I just ask a question about that? There was kind of a drip of rotations of units to the Baltic states. It was very much, as you say, a half measure. I've just been wondering whether countries have been able to keep up the commitments that they did make, a number of years ago when this step was taken. Given the stress that particularly Western European militaries have been under, it's just a factual question. Have you continued to receive the unit, the rotational forces?
Yes. After the commitment to keep enhanced forward presence was made in the Baltic countries and other countries, I mean, this has been maintained. But that means that in Lithuania, for example, there are 2 NATO rotational battalions in addition to Lithuanian sort of forces, and that's clearly not enough. This is a very, very sort of thin tripwire. So we need to scale up to the brigade level force, and that's the sort of the bone of contention. For example, brigade in Lithuania, brigade in Latvia, brigade in Estonia, similar sort of size deployments in Romania and Bulgaria. But that's what we have to do during the war, actually, while the war is going on. What's next? I mean, sort of it very much depends on the how this war will end. And in fact, we have no other options. It has to end not only with Ukraine's victory, but also with Russia's defeat. It needs to be not only pushed out from Ukraine's territory, but also to be rendered incapable of launching any other sort of military aggressions, whether against NATO countries or against its neighbors in other directions like Georgia or Kazakhstan, where it also sort of entertains aggressive thoughts occasionally. So for the sake of the stability on the continent, we have to, collectively, with the help of Ukrainians, achieve that. Otherwise, it will be just a breathing space until this ideologically sort of imperialist regime thinks of a new adventure, new sort of new direction of aggression. And before that then happens, sort of we need to actually rethink the whole sort of architecture. And Ukraine's membership in NATO is an essential part of it. The sort of to have probably the biggest and certainly most battle-hardened army on the European continent in NATO is essential for it to be sort of capable of deterring Russia enough so that it doesn't meditate any other sort of aggressive moves.
So before we move to topics that go beyond the upcoming Vilnius summit, I think we have to sort of tick the last box on your list, which is the question of defense spending. And so there are two dimensions to this question. First, I wonder what your message is to Lithuania's European partners that 16 months into the war still do not spend enough on their defense, on NATO's collective defense. Either what sort of suasion or tactics or sort of rhetorical devices you are planning to deploy there. And then secondly, a related question is not just the sort of how much question, but also the how question. So yesterday, I'm going back to the Macron speech, which was delivered in a very conciliatory tone, but it also included a thinly veiled criticism of Eastern European countries, particularly Poland, that have invested into weapon systems and capabilities that are produced outside of Europe. And he basically said that this was sort of the beginning of sort of future troubles, because we should be instead investing into European sort of industrial base, under the rubric of Europe's strategic autonomy. So what would be your response to sort of Macron's, aching for a Europe that is acting supposedly independently of American voters' will, as he put it?
Well, it's an accepted practice not to comment on other European leaders' speeches. But what sometimes slightly sort of frightens me is that there's a lot of thinking that the war in Ukraine, Russia's war against Ukraine, is a kind of isolated episode, a blip. When it finishes, we can go back to business as usual. We can sort of we can forget about sort of commitments to increase defense spending. We can sort of forget the commitments to upgrade our military and render it defense capable, and we'll be back to business as usual. Well, no, I mean, sort of there is going to be no going back to business as usual, like there was no sort of going back after the Second World War. We didn't revert into kind of interwar reality. I mean, it was a new reality. So whichever way the war ends, and it's going to be a new reality, and we will see at that point that those 30 years after the end of the Cold War was a kind of unexpected peace dividend, which we sort of, because it lasted a long time, we sort of got accustomed to it, and we thought this is normality. No, this is not normality. This is a sort of deviation from the normal. We have to go back to kind of being capable of defending ourselves, to spending more on defense, to investing into our military, because we are going into increasingly unpredictable, aggressive, and rapacious world, if you may, sort of where sort of authoritarian superpowers will be trying to divide the world in their vicinity and even maybe further afield. So we have to be prepared for that, and we have to forget the kind of this somnolent, peaceful, optimistically fatalistic sort of normal that was from 91 till 2022. So that's a message, and the spending is the first step in doing that. We have to look actually further. We have to look into the structure of the spending, investment, and when people try to sort of kind of contrast and oppose, buying military hardware from the States or other NATO countries outside Europe and Europe. I mean, it's not either or, it's and. I mean, so yes, we have to bolster defense industry capability in Europe because we realize we don't have enough shells, missiles, tanks to supply to Ukraine. But that doesn't exclude also buying from the allies. So NATO has to as far as it's NATO, we are well integrated. The fact that Poles are buying tanks from South Korea is not a reflection that they spurn other tanks. They just want tanks in place before Russians have the idea to move on them. So this is overriding concern, I think, and yes, I'm all for the defense industry in Europe, but we have to have both.
Let's expand the conversation a bit. Lithuania has possibly not by choice, but certainly very powerfully recognized that Europe doesn't exist in a global vacuum. I'm talking particularly about the fact of growing Chinese power and also the dangers posed by that. I think it would be a good idea for you to give our listeners a little bit of a summary of that story, and also you're drawing closer to Taiwan, which is very cheering for us in America. But also give us a sense of whether the realities that you see are increasingly shared across Europe, and particularly Western Europe. It may be one thing to say, okay, we can't do business with the Russians for some time under these circumstances. We'll just make up the difference and we'll sell BMWs to the Chinese or something like that in order to keep our standard of living high. But again, just tell us the story of Lithuania's experience over the last 10 years or whatever exactly it's been, why you made the choices that you have made, and how you would recommend those to your European colleagues.
Thank you. That's a fundamental question. And when the present government came into office in early 21, one of the first sort of goals was actually to diversify away from dependence on China. And we had, precedents before that, because we had our economy overly dependent on Russia, on Belarus, where it was easy to do business, but very sort of, in the long term, risky in giving these authoritarian regimes leverage over your own economy, over your politics, over society, over energy dependence, and things like that. And having diversified from dependence, for example, on Russian energy resources, Lithuania was the first country to totally cut off all sort of energy resources from Russia. We realized the dangers of such dependence. So one of the first goals was to first diversify away from dependence on China, and to expand our footprint in East Asia, but also support democratic developments and democracies worldwide. So the result of that was that we were the first to leave this clientelist format of what was called 17+1, as sort of a clustering of Central and Eastern European countries plus China. That was one of the first sort of things to do, and I spent some time on the phone with then my counterpart in the People's Republic of China, saying that we're not going to participate in this anymore. And the next step was allowing Taiwan to open its office in Vilnius under the name of Taiwan, not in any way sort of denying our sort of one China policy, but maintaining that Taiwan has the right not to be called euphemistically sort of Taipei. So and that provoked sort of absolutely immense reaction by China. Well, our trade fell by sort of 75% in the end. I mean, sort of we thought it was going to be even more than that. But the interesting thing is that during the last year, the growth of our trade with other East Asian countries actually was bigger than what we lost in trade with China. And so, we demonstrated very practically, okay, it was a bit of a crash course in demonstration, but we demonstrated that one can diversify away from China. One can sort of de-link and from dependence on supply chains, on export markets, and actually survive as an economy. So I think this is a salutary lesson. And to people who want to listen to us, we're happy to share how we did it. There's been a lot of sort of hard work behind this, and a lot of help from our friends and allies, such as US, Taiwan itself, other like-minded countries, not least EU, which supported us in the World Trade Organization case against Chinese economic coercion. But more importantly, I think it sent the message that it demonstrated very clearly what can happen if you are overly dependent on China. These levers, they can be pulled anytime and for different reasons. It doesn't have to be a Taiwanese representative office. It can be some other sort of aggravation that might arise in the eye of the communist beholder. So I think this message kind of percolated to sort of policy making cycles across EU. And when we read speeches like our Swedish Prime Minister's 2 days ago, which very cautiously but very sort of clearly says that we have to move beyond this naivete and sort of naive optimism vis-a-vis China. When you have similar statements coming from other chancelleries and presidencies and ministers of foreign affairs in Europe, one feels that there is a sort of sea change. There is a sea change, and even though sort of with Europe, it's always one step forward, two backwards. But
let me just add a little footnote to this, which is that there isn't always a perfect overlap between sort of perceptions and expectations and reality, particularly when it comes to the sort of economic significance of relations with China. So trade is one aspect that you sort of hinted at, but the other one, which was one of the driving forces behind the 17+1 format, was the expectation that there was somehow this Chinese investment just aching to flood Central and Eastern Europe. And partly, especially in the case of, say, the Czech Republic, the sort of move away from China was driven by the fact that the reality had nothing to do with those expectations. That the Chinese were interested in making, few sort of high-profile investments, but there was nothing in it for those countries yet. It's not just the sort of Eastern Europe, Western Europe divide, but even in the region, concretely in sort of Poland, there still are, people in some circles who still harbor hope for Polish investment. I saw conversations within the ruling Law and Justice Party that were sort of hinting at the possibility that if the EU is that does not provide the funds that under the sort of rule of law rubric, that they might turn to the Chinese. I think those hopes are going to be disappointed, but it would be interesting to sort of see when Poles themselves, who have been outstanding allies in so many ways, are going to be sort of disabused of whatever sort of leftover illusions they might harbor about China.
Right. Well, you will have to ask Poles about that. But you're absolutely right. In terms of delivering on expected investment, except for two countries which rendered themselves kind of vassals of Beijing in this whole grouping. For the rest, one could say about the promises of China, what people used to say about Brazil, that it's a country of the future and will always remain so. Chinese promise of investment is the sort of the thing of the future and will always remain so. But it was a powerful sort of expectation. But yes, it didn't deliver. And when it does deliver, the only sort of it's not the case that Europe doesn't deliver on investment. It doesn't deliver in transparent investment. On sort of transparent on investment without strings attached, and that used to be the principal sort of purchasing point of that Chinese investment through the Belt and Road Initiative in the developing countries. But even they're becoming more realistic about what they get. They get quite a lot of sort of invisible strings attached, and so there is a growing realism, and I'm happy that sort of in Europe we are finally moving beyond this sort of naive and optimist attitude.
Vice Minister, I'm joining late, but I want to continue on this thread, though slightly changing the topic. To me, Chinese investments, or the temptation or of an interest in Chinese investments across Central and Eastern Europe has, over the last few years also been about, is there a Western alternative or not? Sure, we would prefer Western technology, American, EU, and less strings attached. But if there's no option, and the other option is Russia, countries like Ukraine will accept China when the EU is not an option. And so that makes me turn to EU and Ukraine and ask you, over the last few months, there's been inching in the larger EU capitals on the topic of should we have a faster accession? Should we talk about integration already of Ukraine and Moldova into the European Union? And as we're speaking, the political community summit, the second one initiated by Macron, is taking place in Chisinau, Moldova. And a lot of discussion has been around whether this is an attempt by Paris to create an alternative to EU fast track membership for Ukraine and Moldova, but particularly Ukraine. So, my question to you is, what are you hearing? What is Lithuania's position on this? And how do you see the path towards EU accession and significant progress on that within this year for Ukraine and Moldova both?
Right. Well, European political community. I think if there were some, designs to make it an alternative to EU membership, they may have sort of been in place before the Prague summit. I think during the summit and immediately afterwards, this notion that it can be a substitute was pretty much sort of pushed out of sight, and so I don't think that there's a sort of viable track of discussion that the EPC, European Political Community, which is meeting today in Chisinau, can be a way of avoiding the question of what to do with Ukraine, with Moldova, perhaps with Georgia, in terms of European Union membership. And now the principal question is what reforms would be needed in order to accommodate, especially a large country like Ukraine, especially given the fact that quite a few Western European countries emphasize that integration of Ukraine and Moldova into the EU has to proceed step by step with integrating Western Balkan countries, which, well, obviously they're not as big and sort of massive as Ukraine, but they also bring their own sort of concerns and their own problems which would need to be resolved. So this is trying to package it together with Western Balkans, in a sense, tries to postpone the time when Ukraine integration can take place. But again, quite a lot will depend on Ukraine itself, on the results of that sort of track record on reforms, on the sort of points raised by the Commission last year as a condition to moving further. And we monitor this. We try to help Ukraine as much as we can with our own transformational expertise, by entering EU and actually sort of adopting its rules as path forward to creating successful economy and society and state institutions, how it can help. And there's a lot of transformative potential in Ukraine. The fact that sort of this country is able to reform itself and at a very rapid pace. Obviously, there are setbacks. Obviously, there are difficulties. Obviously, there are sort of occasional blind spots. But nevertheless, the overall record is very impressive, and it's doing so at the speed which would be even unimaginable to a lot of countries in peacetime, and they're doing it under war, under sort of war conditions. So. I think to fail to recognize that may be politically impossible. So I'm very hopeful about sort of starting negotiations or moving towards starting negotiations later this year. Obviously, we'll have to wait for Commission's report in the autumn, but in the interim. We have to do everything we can to help Ukraine to speed along this path of reforms, and I'm confident that this will happen, and this will happen sooner than we sometimes think.
If I may follow up on that, just very quickly, you kind of pointed to the wound here that I think we've seen with several statements from Western leaders through the last few months, and I'm thinking also about the Munich Security Conference this year, where some in Western capitals have been arguing the war should not be an excuse for faster integration, fast-tracked integration. And the debate is changing, just like here in Washington, the debate has been changing about what kind of weapons to give Ukraine, etc. So What is your take as we're inching towards the second half of this year? Do you think that, are you confident that this argument is fading within the European Union community, or are we still looking at significant obstacles in the context of exactly that special circumstances for Ukraine because of the war, or not accepting special circumstances?
Oh, I don't think that we should, argue that, war is in any way sort of an excuse for fast integration. I mean, war and certain sympathy with Ukraine helped to break the deadlock on paralysis of political will to move forward. But from the very first sort of moment of granting the candidate status, we argue that it has to be merit based, and Ukraine's recognized that it has to be merit based. So war should not be an excuse, but neither should war be an obstacle. And that we should recognize the fact that the country is doing an impressive transformation during the war. So I think sort of it can hold itself, its own under the same stringent criteria it's being applied to Western Balkans. So if we don't treat war as an obstacle to further integration, then I'm pretty confident it will qualify.
Throughout this region, just to change the subject a little bit, countries and their populations are being bombarded with Russian propaganda, disinformation operations, Russia exploiting every fissure in the social fabric to sort of tear these societies apart. Again, I'm recording this from Slovakia, where Russia has made significant headways and where the public opinion has really shifted in a rather disturbing fashion. Now, Lithuania is a country that has a sizable Russian-speaking minority. And to me, as an outside observer at least, Lithuania seems completely immune to those sorts of Russian efforts. Like, why is that? Like, how have you immunized your population, including the Russian-speaking part, against Russian disinfo and hybrid warfare, if you will?
Thank you. Well, in contradistinction to other countries in the vicinity, other Baltic countries, our Russian minority is comparatively small. It's only sort of 6%, and quite a lot of it comes from the old times when they were the escapees from tyrannical Russian regimes from the 16th, 17th century, and then when they're fleeing persecution by Moscow despots in the previous iterations. I think the second element to this is that early on, immediately in the aftermath of the invasion of Crimea, annexation of Crimea and invasion of eastern Ukraine, we realized the dangers that Russian propaganda poses, and so we moved ahead of other EU countries on limiting its reach, on limiting what they can do in Lithuania, and so in fact turning off this source of indoctrination and disinformation, which still, for example, exists in quite a few other EU countries, let alone other countries bordering Russia, which are not members of the EU. So we have to take care of the information hygiene, as it were. And this is a very sort of sensitive issue because we have to. There's a tension, obviously, between providing certain standards of public information with sort of maintaining freedom of speech and then freedom of information. But this balance has to be found. In all democratic societies, there has to be balance between sort of freedom and responsibility. Freedom and security, so freedom of information and sort of security of information, security of having access to truthful information, which I think is also a right that people have to be able to entertain, right to truth, and not to be overwhelmed with lies and government-paid distortion of reality.
I wonder, just to conclude, whether we can go back to where we started, meeting the Vilnius summit and the war in Ukraine as it is now. This week, President Zelensky has basically said, we are ready to go with our long-awaited, long-anticipated counteroffensive. And it could well be the case by the time of the summit in July that he can come to Vilnius not just as a victim, but as a victor. What do you think the upside possibilities could be? Conversely, if things go badly, it could be a unhappy occasion. But how could the summit take a quantum leap forward in support for Ukraine? And do you think a demonstrable success in this counteroffensive would create that kind of momentum.
Oh, absolutely. And, we have to realize that from the very first day of war, our sort of expectations have been on a sort of sliding scale. And the reluctance to supply arms in the first instance was linked to the fact that we thought Ukraine was not going to last till the beginning of next week. So certainly sort of Ukraine's victory on the battlefield would be a great boost to its NATO aspirations, to its European aspirations, and generally to encouraging us to help more, to deliver more, and to be ready to do it in a speedier manner. But as you say, the fortunes of war are uncertain. So we have to prepare our sort of default position is that we have to push these policies forward regardless of how this counteroffensive goes, because the cause doesn't cease to be right just because it doesn't immediately becomes victorious. We have only one path forward, and that's to defeat Russia on the battlefield, to render it incapable of further aggression, and our sort of security is predicated on that. Peace on European continent is predicated on that. So we have to push forward with these policies, regardless of how Ukrainians fare. And I wish them all the best. I trust in their victory, but we have to be prepared to be allies in the fair and as well as bad weather.
Amen to that. Vice Minister, thank you so much for your time. We understand you're running on a very busy schedule.
Thank you.
From me, Elburaj.
Me, Giselle Donnelly, and
Julia Zsoza.
Thank you for listening to the Eastern Front, a podcast dedicated to security challenges that have erupted along the line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. You can find additional content, more episodes on our website, ai.org, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this show, please rate and review us. It helps others find the podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to our Eastern Front newsletter, which will bring you a fortnightly dose of news from the Eastern Front. Thank you and goodbye.